welcome to everyone. Hopefully everyone's made their way through from the lobby into the session today. A welcome for those that regularly attend our sessions. You'll probably be familiar with myself, but I'm going to do a quick introduction in any case. I'm Manveen. I'm the Learning and Development Manager here at the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our session today, hosted by Alice from Mills and Reeve on green rebuilding, navigating resilience and risk. Before I hand over to Alice and before we start, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping points. You'll notice that you can't actually use your microphone or camera. They are turned off at the moment just so that we're not competing with bandwidth for the session. So please don't panic. We will allow mics and cameras on during Q&A at the end, which we'll have at the end of the session. So if you do have questions, please make note of them and we'll come back to them. There's also an opportunity to connect with Alice if you're not able to ask your question or if you have any questions that come up post-session. And hopefully you can see that on the slides. There's an opportunity to connect with Alice as well. This session is being recorded and a link will be shared post-event together with a link to our feedback survey. So please take time to complete this. It should take you no more than 2 minutes, but it just means that we can continue delivering the best content. And a reminder that these sessions are accredited by the COI for their content. So if you feel this meets your learning objectives, you can include it on your CPD log. That leaves me to introduce today's session and hand over to Alice, and we'll get the session underway. So thank you all.
Thanks very much, Manveen. Yes, lovely to be here today. And actually, I was going to talk about lots of rain in this country, but it's really sunny here in London today. I'm Alice Wilson. I'm a partner in Mills and Reeve's insurance disputes team. So we're a law firm specialising in everything to do with property insurance in my team in particular. Today, Manveen, do you want to just, sorry, I haven't got control of the slides, so I'll be reliant on you, Manveen, to switch it on. Do you mind just flicking it to the next slide, please? So today we're talking about green rebuilding and in particular navigating resilience and risk. It's an interesting subject and I think it's something that's going to be of ever increasing focus for insurers in the years to come. Next slide, please. We have 4 learning objectives today. So I'm hoping by the end of this session, you'll be able to outline fundamental principles of sustainable or green rebuilding. Oh, sorry, Manveen, do you mind going back to the 4? That's okay. Describe why sustainable rebuilding is of increasing importance to the insurance industry. Explain the role of green endorsements. And finally, list some of the factors which might need to be considered from a risk perspective. Next slide, please. So before I start looking in detail at those objectives, I just wanted to think a little bit about what the backdrop is to green rebuilding. Why are we talking about this and why is it important? I'm sure everyone on this session knows that the fundamental backbone of this type of insurance is the indemnity principle. And that's been long adhered to, certainly in property insurance, which is what my team deals with. I think it traces back to the 18th century. And as we all know, that the position under the indemnity principle is that what an insurer is required to do is put its insured back into the position that it was just before the time of the loss. But with significant changes across the globe, including most pointedly for this session, climate change, it probably is important to start asking the question whether the indemnity principle is still fit for purpose in a changing world. And that really forms the backdrop to today's session. So let's start delving into the learning objectives. Next slide, please. And next slide. Thank you. And I just touched on this. Sorry, Manveen, the previous slide. You're keeping me on my toes today. That's it. Yeah, just focusing on climate change quickly. It's something that certainly for property insurers, but probably the insurance industry generally, it's something that cannot be avoided. It's just at the forefront of our minds that there's this huge impact globally and within the UK on the insurance sector, and really just generally for business and people being affected on a daily basis. It costs the economy a significant amount each year. It certainly costs the insurance industry a significant amount each year. I saw last week, and I'm sure some of you saw this too, a report from Aviva saying that 1 in 9 new homes is now built in an area at risk of flooding. And the Environment Agency, who look very, very closely at the statistics on this subject, say that at the moment, around 6.3 million properties in England alone are likely to be on areas at risk of flood from either rivers, the sea, or surface water. And actually, quite alarmingly, if we fast forwarded to 2050, it might look more like 1 in 4 properties within an area of flood risk. So it's a really important thing for insurers to be thinking about. And with that in mind, I think today's session is probably going to focus our minds on what insurers can do about this and help play their part in helping to mitigate the risk of climate change. And next slide, please, Manveen. So the first learning objective is to understand what's meant by sustainable rebuilding, or sometimes you'll see it referred to as green rebuilding. There is no one definition of what green rebuilding means, and it's important to know that. But I just wanted to start by looking at some basic principles. So first of all, considering the actual physical fabric of a building. This would be how it's actually built, and you'd be looking towards things like using improved insulation, glazing techniques, and thermal mass during the reinstatement process. And then secondly, sustainable sourcing, transitioning from using carbon-intensive materials such as concrete and steel to low carbon alternatives such as CLT or recycled aggregates. Next, thinking about the circularity of what you're using. For example, can any demolition waste be reused? And finally, future-proofing, buildings that are constructed for the climate that we're going to have in 2050 and not looking backwards at what the climate was like, say, in 1990. So those are 4 kind of cornerstones of what green rebuilding might involve. So let's move on to look at it in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. As I said, there's no one definition of green rebuilding, and I thought these 2 quotes capture it quite well. The first quote, I think, just makes the point that there cannot be one definition. So this comes from the World Green Building Council, and they said that any building can be a sustainable building, but not all sustainable buildings are the same. Different countries and regions have distinctive climatic conditions, unique cultures and traditions, diverse building types and ages, or wide-ranging environmental, economic, and social priorities. That's to say, there just can't be a one-size-fits-all approach to green rebuilding at all. But I thought actually that the next slide captures really well what I think in an ideal world green rebuilding would involve. And this comes from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. A green building should involve a systems approach to design, procurement, construction, and operation that minimises the environmental impact of the built environment, improves social outcomes, protects and restores nature, and promotes circularity and resource efficiency throughout a building's life cycle. Now, I think if you've achieved that, you've probably achieved perfection. And that, I think that's what we should really be looking towards in the future. So next slide, please. So what might the nuts and bolts of achieving your ideal green rebuild look like? What might you have to think about? Well, I'm not a building surveyor, I'm not an architect, but I've put on this slide some things that I think might factor into a building that is more sustainable. High performance insulation, high efficiency heating, cooling and ventilation systems, smart thermostats, automated HVAC controls, LED and sensor controlled lighting, renewable energy, so the use of solar panels, which is becoming increasingly widely used, I think. And as I've touched on previously, using recycled or reclaimed materials, using natural materials, trying to preserve water. So, for example, using low flow fixtures, double flushes, minimizing the use of electric lighting. So designing buildings with as much daylight as you can by introducing skylights where possible. And you can see on this slide, there's a picture of what's called a green wall, and I'll explain in a minute what that is and why that helps the building's overall energy performance. So next slide, please. I wanted to also, when we're thinking about sustainable building, discuss modern methods of construction. Now, modern methods of construction aren't exactly the same as, they don't necessarily always equate to being sustainable methods of construction. I just wanted to make that point, but often they are. So they might be used for a combination of either cost saving, or they may just make the build quicker, but they may also introduce some elements of improving the sustainability of a building. So I wanted to touch on them and just look at some of their main features. So volumetric, that's where entire rooms or units are actually pre-built in a factory, including everything that would be needed, wiring, plumbing, everything you can imagine, a kind of whole room basically, and then shipped onto or transported onto the site. Now you might think, why would that be energy efficient? Well, I suppose there's less likely to be any kind of wastage in a factory. I guess they're very efficient environments. Everything will be calculated to the nth degree. Where you have a more traditional method of construction, I guess materials are being transported on and off of site using various different people, lots of different vehicles coming and going. Here you just have one unit coming in on one time, however it's transported, some huge vehicle probably. So there's an element there of kind of reducing carbon emissions. The second on the slide is panelized. That's similar in some ways. That's flat panels which are manufactured off-site and assembled on-site. So I think there'd be similar sustainability advantages with that. Cross-laminated timber, that's a very strong material that can actually be used in place of concrete or steel, and that's a completely carbon neutral material to be using. Low carbon concrete, using mixed recycled aggregates or binders. Insulated concrete formwork, that's hollow blocks of insulation, stacked, reinforced with steel and filled with concrete on site. And then finally, as I mentioned, and you saw in the photograph on the last slide, a living or a green wall. And that's a wall where you see climbing plants completely covering the external facade of the building. And that can help with all sorts of different things, including thermal insulation, evaporative cooling, and it can actually really improve the air quality of the building. So, next slide, please. So let's move on to consider the second learning objective. Why are we here today? Why is sustainable rebuilding of increasing importance to insurers? Well, there's so many different reasons, and I've tried to touch on some of the main ones today, and you can see these on this diagram here. We do have and have seen and will see in the coming years a tightening of the regime, statutory and legal, around making sure that buildings are constructed in an energy efficient manner. So we've seen the building regulations be tightened and changes to the minimum energy efficiency standards, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. I think for property insurers in particular, there's a huge advantage to making sure that buildings are as resilient as they can be, because this is likely to either completely mitigate the risk of another loss occurring, or if another loss does occur, will hopefully completely reduce the quantum of that loss, because the damage caused will be much less. Insurers are under their own ESG disclosure requirements, so they have to report on the greenness of their underwriting portfolio, and this sustainable rebuilding really helps with that. There'll be advantages in terms of brand and client retention. Probably would be seeing an increasing expectation in the coming years from policyholders for there to be some option for green reinstatement and green rebuilding within the policy, either as something that they can purchase as an add-on, or possibly, I would say increasingly, it becoming a free incorporated part of that type of policy. There's an increasing regulatory focus, so the Financial Conduct Authority, the Prudential Regulation Authority are putting an increasing onus on insurers to show what they're doing to help transition to net zero. And then finally, I've put on there, it's a bit kind of vague, but just doing the right thing. I think the insurance industry is in a very unique position insofar as when it comes to rebuilding, it can really set the standards and lead the way, and it really can put its own stamp on helping achieve net zero both within the UK and also globally. So I think all of those things are very important. And I just want to move on to look at some of the more important ones in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Manveen. So let's look at the regulatory reasons. A lot of this is around making sure that buildings are as efficient as they can be and minimise energy wastage. So in England and Wales, there are major changes to the minimum energy efficiency standards, or MEES as they're sometimes called, and these are scheduled to come in 2027 and 2030. And they're really important for property insurers, property owners insurers, and any policyholder who owns a property portfolio, whether that's for their own purposes or whether it's for rental purposes. So from the 1st of October 2030, all private rental properties must achieve an EPC rating as a minimum. Now, if a rental property suffers a fire or some other kind of loss, and the insurer doesn't reinstate it to that standard, as from that date onwards, the policyholder is going to be left with a almost useless asset because they're not going to be able to rent it out. Now, these haven't come into place. I think there was a consultation in May that the government carried out, and we're just waiting to see when this is all going to officially come into force, but it's highly likely that the dates in these slides are going to remain accurate. There has been some talk of some of these dates being moved even sooner. For commercial properties, by 2027, an EPC rating of C needs to be achieved, and by 2030, an even higher rating of B needs to be achieved. And there are similar considerations, really, in the event of a loss, the destruction of that property or damage of that property. The owner does not want to find itself with an asset that is just completely non-compliant. So, they're going to possibly look to their insurance, but they'll need to make sure that they have the right insurance in place that will cover the cost of rebuilding that property to the necessary standards. Otherwise, again, they'll be left with an asset that just isn't compliant at all. In 2022 and 2023, we saw some quite nuanced changes to the building regulations, Part L, that required lower CO2 emissions for new homes and non-domestic buildings. And finally, the FCA UK Sustainability Reporting Standards are expected to come into force on or before the 1st of January 2027. And they will require an insurer to disclose how they intend to manage their own transition to a low carbon economy. So, this isn't something that insurers can bury their heads in the sand about. There's a lot of things either in place now or coming further down the line very soon that puts an increasing onus on their obligations in relation to sustainability. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to look at some of the other reasons, and as I said, these aren't intended to be a definitive list of all the reasons. There are many, and I'm sure some of you have got your own views as well. An important one, I think, actually, is the first one on this slide, is brand and reputation. I think it's really good if an insurer can demonstrate transition leadership so they can show their commitment to net zero. And if they can align with their policyholders' ESG requirements and expectations and help their own policyholders achieve those, I think it could be really good for business and really good for their own brand. And as for the reasons I've just explained, it's something that's going to become increasingly important over the coming years. And in a similar vein, I think insurers need to stay ahead of this market. If this is the direction of travel, which I think it is, it's important that insurers are seen to be ahead of the competition and maybe even taking a market share while competitors catch up. So in some sense, there's a real opportunity to be had there as well. Sustainable rebuilding also will feed into the insurer's own ESG policy and their own board reporting requirements. And finally, it reflects well on an insurer's commitment to consumer duty if they can be seen to be helping policyholders meet their minimum energy efficiency requirements, lower their energy bills, and support their own ESG goals. Can only be a good thing in terms of an insurer's duty towards their own policyholders. Next slide, please. So let's get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts. And this is the third learning objective, which is to be able to understand what a green endorsement is. Now, they'll sometimes be described in other ways. So we've got an example on the slide here that simply says environmental protection, or they might be called a green condition or green clause or some other description. But basically what they do is, instead of a standard policy, which will cover on a like-for-like basis, a green endorsement will provide cover for the additional limits required to upgrade the property to sustainable standards and certifications. So, for example, BREEAM or LEED. Typically, the coverage would include certification costs, the cost of sustainable materials, the installation of renewable energy sources, and the usual principle of betterment would be waived. Also, you might see longer business interruption indemnity periods to account for the fact that there may be longer lead-in times to source the right materials. And I think it's really important actually that the policyholder has knowledge that this is an important thing for them to think about. They need to know that if there is no cover under the policy for these costs, that they may find themselves with a non-compliant building or just having to foot the bill themselves. I've just put an example here, the environmental protection clause you can see on the slide. And this says that in the event of damage to property insured, if the insured elects and the insurer consents to rebuild or repair using the latest available materials and methods in a manner that aims to limit potential harm to the environment by improving energy efficiency or reducing carbon emissions or atmospheric pollution, cover will include the reasonable additional costs incurred with the insurer's prior consent. You can see here that the insurer is basically saying we won't say that there's been betterment. And what's good about this clause is it does specifically spell out what the standards are. So as I'll come on to, there is scope for some dispute in relation to precisely what's covered under a clause like this. But this one says, in respect of buildings, it must comply with the principles of the Building Research Establishment's Environmental Assessment Methodology, which is easier to say BREEAM standard, and achieve a BREEAM rating of good or above. So that's kind of how you'll see a green endorsement in practice. Let's just move on to consider a few more things that you might need to think about in relation to a green endorsement. As I've said, where there is this type of cover, an insurer would waive the traditional betterment rule. So they would pay, for example, for the cost of a new high efficiency heat pump to replace an old boiler. And it is important, as I've touched on just now, to ascertain whether the green cover pays for specific certifications and ratings. This could include the work required, the materials and the certification costs. And you may see cover, for example, to a minimum of $1 million or 10% of the loss. It may be worded in that kind of way. And you might also see with this type of endorsement a requirement that either the building has to be completely destroyed in order for it to be triggered, or for it to be 80% destroyed or something like that. It's probably unlikely to be applicable where there's just been minor damage to a property. And then you might see some conditions attached to this type of cover. For example, you might need to show evidence of maintenance of heating systems, and there might be other requirements. So each green endorsement might be worded quite differently one to the next. And I think, as I say, as I'll come on to as well, the more specific they are, probably the more useful they are, and the less likely they are to lead to policy coverage disputes. Next slide, please. So let's move on to look at the final learning objective. What factors might need to be considered from a risk perspective? I've tried to divide this into practical risks and then also legal risks. So we'll start with a few practical risks, and as with the other slides, this is by no means a definitive list. It's just some important things to think about. So one of those is supply chain volatility. You may find when you're having to rebuild in a sustainable way using sustainable materials, there's much greater volatility in the supply chain. Materials might be a lot harder to source, and it might take a lot longer for them to be either sourced or delivered. And that's going to have a knock-on to the indemnity period for business interruption, and also alternative accommodation. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. We looked at just now some of the newer methods of construction. Now, they bring lots of benefits, and we talked about what some of those might be, but in some respects they do introduce new risks potentially because they're relatively untested. So I've just put a snip there from a headline where an insurer was concerned about the risk posed by living walls. Some of these materials may present a slightly higher fire risk, and there may be other risks associated with these modern methods of construction being relatively untested, and that actually could form a talk in and of itself. But it's just something to think about. And then finally, I've just put on the last pointer there, it's always important, particularly with property insurance, that the valuation of the risk is as accurate as it can be. We are seeing just so much underinsurance. In fact, I would almost go as far to say on every single case that we see, there's some form of underinsurance. It's all the more likely, I would argue, when you're dealing with a kind of a premises that needs to be rebuilt in a green or sustainable manner. You're going to have to make sure that that reinstatement valuation is really, really accurate and accounts for what could be quite a significantly higher sum than just your traditional reinstatement valuation would. So it's really important that the right experts are sourced and that's approached in quite a thorough forensic way. Next slide, please. And moving on to an area which is slightly closer to home for my usual day-to-day job, factors which might need to be considered from a risk perspective, legal factors. The big one that stands out to me is for a property insurer, one of the key ways of balancing the books, as it were, is after they've paid out, after a loss, after a claim, they want to look to whether there's a liable third party or third parties and recover the sums that they've paid out. I think if I was a defendant receiving a claim where the building had been reinstated in a sustainable way, I would probably look to challenge the quantum of the claim for the reasons I'm about to explain. So when you are running a subrogated recovery, you're looking at things, kind of the way you're looking at things switches to some extent from how something would be adjusted under a policy to how a court would look at what's recoverable as a matter of law. So you have to prove that your losses meet the requirements of the case law. So if your claim is in contract, long established legal principles say that the damages need to arise naturally from the breach of contract and need to have been in the parties' reasonable contemplation when the contract was entered into. And in a similar vein with a claim in tort, the damages must put the party in the position it would have been in had the tort not occurred, and those damages need to be reasonably foreseeable and not too remote. And I think it's very open to a defendant to say, well, hang on a second, it's great that you've rebuilt in a sustainable way, but that doesn't fit with the legal analysis of what's recoverable as a matter of law. So we're going to try and argue down your losses as much as we possibly can. And finally, any claimant in any legal action is under a duty to mitigate their losses, and I can envisage similar arguments being raised, for example, in relation to a business interruption claim. It might be open to them to say, well, this took twice as long because you were rebuilding in a sustainable manner, but actually what the law says is you should have just put them back into the position they were in at the time of the loss. So, you know, this has gone on for far too long and we're only going to pay you half, for example. And I can really see those sorts of arguments flying, and it'll be interesting to see whether any of these sorts of things are looked at by the courts anytime soon. Just moving on to the next slide. Another thing that myself and my team deal with on a daily basis is policy coverage disputes. And I do think this type of green insurance may be quite ripe for policy coverage disputes in relation to, in particular, the extent of cover. And I've said this previously, I think it's really important that the cover is really clearly defined. So, for example, if you had a green clause that just said, we agree to pay the costs of rebuilding in a green way, that could leave so much room for interpretation that I can really see the insurer is going to be arguing one thing, policyholder is going to be arguing another, which is why the clause we looked at that specifically set out what the standards would be that it should be rebuilt to is a good example of, I think, the kind of precision that should be included in that type of wording. Also, definitions need to be closely considered. I mean, these are quite general principles of drafting anyway, but I just think in green insurance, it might be even more important to make sure that everything is as tightly worded and clearly thought about as it possibly can be. You know, so does the cover extend to achieving compliance with building regs or other statutory regulatory standards? Does the policy contain a public authority clause, and is there any clash there? Is there anything that's inconsistent? So, as I say, this is by no means a definitive list, but this is sort of where my brain would take me, and this is the sort of thing I think should be thought about. Next slide, please. So just pulling everything together, this is a very whistle-stop case study, and my lawyer brain doesn't like it because I'd like to put in a whole policy wording, a whole forensic expert report, etc. But we don't have time for that. So this is just to give you a little bit of a flavour of how you might approach this in real life, as it were. So in this scenario, the insurer's policy provides cover for damage caused by insured perils to an office block in London, which was built in 1985. And the building currently has a pretty poor EPC rating of E. Unfortunately, a huge fire occurs, causing considerable damage. Now, as I've touched upon, in a few years' time, under the new standards, the building will need to have an EPC C rating. So in this scenario, we're fast forwarding by a few years. We're putting ourselves in a position that this has all actually come into force. Now, the policy in this scenario is a standard property damage business interruption policy. It has a public authorities clause and a £500,000 green rebuilding endorsement. Like-for-like reinstatement would cost £5 million, and to reach EPCC would cost a whopping £7.5 million. So, Manveen, could you move on to the next slide, please? So the question just to ponder is whether the insurance in this case study, the insurer in this case study is liable to the policyholder in respect of the £2.5 million shortfall. So just have a little think about that. And we'll move on to the next slide, please. So, of course, there isn't going to be a straightforward yes or no answer. Everything really will hinge around what the policy wording says and the specific facts of what's happened. But just a few pointers. In relation to a public authorities clause, bear in mind this usually covers the cost of reinstatement to comply with statutory requirements, but it's usually triggered by the damage itself. So in this scenario, if the local authority said, well, yes, in order to give you the requisite permit to rebuild, you need to meet these standards, then fine, that probably is triggered. But if it's just so that the landlord can achieve the correct EPC rating in the future, or just generally so that they can let the property out, I doubt very much that it is going to be triggered. Here, the green rebuilding cover is really low. It's capped at 500,000. So it's clearly woefully inadequate in this scenario. Also, just given potential for longer lead-in times, and I didn't say this actually, in the scenario, I would say there would be a 12-month BI indemnity period. It might be very likely that the actual rebuild would take longer than that, so that might be inadequate. So really just the takeaway is in this type of scenario, the policyholder could find themselves facing quite a significant shortfall, depending on exactly what the policy wording says. So it just hammers home the point of how careful the wording needs to be and how much really insurers and insureds need to understand the importance of what's on offer and what they've got. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Manveen. This is just a quick recap of our learning objectives. So number one, what is green rebuilding? Well, as I said, there's no one definition. It will vary depending on where you are in the world, but it should really look like a building that uses sustainable materials, has a sustainable supply chain, considers the use of recycled materials, so circularity of the economy, reuse, and really that improves the resilience of a building to mitigate the impact of future losses. Why is it of increasing importance to insurers? Well, lots of reasons. We looked at the regulatory reasons, we looked at the legal reasons. and things like brand and reputation and taking market share. Showing a commitment to consumer duty and basically doing the right thing and embracing the quite unusual position that insurers have to set the standards in this type of green rebuilding. What's a green endorsement? Effectively, that's insurance, so it's a specific clause in the cover that says that the insurer will pay to reinstate, rebuild the property to a sustainable standard. And the more specific that cover is, the better, and it will usually cover the cost of the materials, the building costs, the cost of professional fees and things like that, the cost of obtaining the certification, and the insurer won't take a point that there's been betterment. What factors may insurers have to consider from a risk perspective? There are lots. There's practical ones such as longer lead-in times, it being difficult to source the right materials. They're going to cost more. Some of the materials or methods of construction may present new risks as they're relatively untested. And then in relation to legal risks, there's probably quite a big hurdle in relation to recovering losses. And there's also potential for policy coverage disputes to arise. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of this subject and an understanding, hopefully, of those 4 learning objectives. There is, by the looks of it, some time for questions. If anyone has any, I'd be very happy to take them. Or as Manveen said, if you think of anything else, I think if you somehow scan the link, the QR code, you'll get to my LinkedIn account, or I think my web profile has my phone number and email address. If you want to get in touch, please do feel free to.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll flick back to that beginning slide just so we can kind of, anyone who wants to recapture any of Alice's details can do so. But I've also just popped up your email and telephone number.
Oh, thank you.
We've got a couple of ways that you can, if you've got questions, that you can ask questions. You should have the option to unmute yourself and possibly turn your camera on. If you do want to ask a question live, feel free just to raise your hand and we can share the floor with you. Or you've got the chat box if you'd like to pop your question in the chat box at all. I'll give it a couple of minutes just in case anyone is typing, and I'll go back to that first slide. So I'm going to flick through everything now, so apologies. There we go. That's Alice's details as well if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn. David, over to you. I can see you popped your hand up. The floor's yours.
Yeah, I'm sort of semi-playing devil's advocate and sort of repeating what you said. So I don't know whether I'm after a specific answer, but you talked about green construction presenting some sort of minor risks. My playing devil's advocate could be that suggesting the push to more environmentally friendly buildings was partly responsible for the Grenfell disaster, because polystyrene is a wonderful insulator, but it burns incredibly well. And whilst none of us appreciated, there are a huge number of buildings that, in an attempt to make them look a bit nicer, but also to be more effective from an insulation perspective, they've been covered with stuff that, if insurers really understood what was going on in their buildings, they'd be very, very worried. So yeah. I suppose I'm sort of throwing that in terms of, we have to balance that risk of, so imagine if you've got a building and you want to make it more environmentally friendly, you could, as the insurer, be funding a rebuild which will actually make the building much less attractive because it's much more prone to further claims.
I think that's a really good point. Definitely, and I think you're right in so many respects there. I mean, what happened with Grenfell was horrific, and hopefully that will never be repeated, but I completely agree with you. There are buildings all across the country where there's a similar type of cladding system in place. Now, thankfully, we now have the Building Safety Act in force, and hopefully that's going to do a lot to mitigate any risk of another Grenfell. But I do think that's a really good point. I think it's really important that as much as insurers can, they understand those risks too. And I would like to think that they're very, very alive to those, and I do think, you know, human safety comes first in any building, and we now have the Building Safety Act, and I do think hopefully so much more is known about the risks associated with the type of cladding we saw in the Grenfell, you know, the awful Grenfell fire, and I think insurers are hopefully so alive to that that isn't going to be repeated, and they're not going to just blindly not know what's, you know, in the buildings they're insuring. They're going to ask the right questions. They're going to, if the right information hasn't been provided, they're going to push back and ask for evidence of precisely how was this constructed, ask for the, you know, almost ask for the project documents if they have to. But no, I do think that's a really good point. I completely take that on board.
Any other questions? We've had nothing come through to the chat, but anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? No, what I'm going to do is just going to share the details one more time for Alice. Actually, I'm going to pop them in the chat box just so that people can grab them nice and easily. But also, I'll also share in the chat just a link to our survey. So if you can just take a few moments to provide some feedback on our sessions, particularly today. So that's Alison's telephone number, and I'll just pop the, sorry, not Alison, sorry, Alice.
Sorry, I get that a lot.
And if there's no further questions, we'll wrap up there. And all that's left for me to say is thank you for your time at attending today's session, and thank you to Alice for giving us a really interesting insight into green rebuilding and what that will mean for the industry, and particularly around resilience and risk. Thank you all for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.